Welcome to Creation to Restoration, the podcast that explores behind the scenes of the biblical timeline. With your hosts, Randall Owens and Andy Patt.
Hey, good morning, Andy.
Morning, Randall. How you doing, man?
I'm doing really, really well. And as we get going today, it's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to be talking about the earth and what it was like before the fall of man and all the way up through the flood, because things were very different back then. But before we get rolling, I want everybody that listens to us on this podcast to know that Sunday we announced that Andy here, our young man Andy, was announced to be an associate pastor here at the church. So congratulations, Andy.
Well, thank you, Randall. It is my honor.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. I just want everybody to know that if you got any complaints or concerns, just talk to Andy now. And don't bring those to me. All right, so let's jump right in. Andy being our resident guy that knows all about creation and the earth and the flood and all those things. So, Andy, tell me, what was the earth like before the fall?
Before the fall, yeah. So before the fall and generally before the flood, it's mostly similar, but a pretty key difference. So the way that the earth was made, when we went through that creation account, we talked about the layer of water in the outer part of the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
That would have done a couple of things. So with that extra layer, because as of currently, gas tends to expand and, to fit its container. And without an outer boundary, we know that our atmosphere extends a long ways and slowly thins and thins until it essentially kind of mixes in and becomes with outer space.
Right.
So just the extent that the gravity can hold it in, sure. Add that layer in there, and what that ends up doing is it compresses the atmosphere into a fixed container. And based on the weight of water and how that ends up working out in terms of being suspended, there's a way to figure out how far above the ground that would be. And when they do the math and they figure that out, and then they figure out what the effect on the air pressure in the earth would be, it turns out that we'd have roughly double the air pressure that we have today.
Okay.
And that would be kind of fixed as a constant. And that ice barrier would also do another thing. It would filter out a ton of the harmful UV light. So we think of the horrifying sun monster out there and what it does to our skin and how it destroys things and the decay that it causes. It would have served as a massive protective barrier around the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, just by, the movie Jurassic Park.
Yes.
Yes,
I'm very familiar with that.
Going in and getting the DNA out of the mosquitoes and whatnot
Right.
to make dinosaurs.
Right.
Well, we don't do that. However, what we have done in plenty of circumstances is finding fossilized amber and then being able to find air bubbles that are trapped in there and then being able to test the composition of the air from whatever period of time it was before it was crystallized. So it doesn't come with a label on it with a date, but we can at least
Right.
know it was a while ago. And what they find too is that oxygen ratios were about 50% higher. Which when we get into some of the other differences, that'll kind of make sense as to why. But if you double air pressure and do 50% greater oxygen, it has a pretty dramatic effect on living creatures.
Okay, so that is a really, really big deal as we start to look at this, pre-flood, pre-fall Earth and the similarities. I can't overemphasize this, the water above the Earth.
Right.
And that changes everything about what we know, and we don't understand that today.
Right.
We don't think about it like that today. So what did you say? It doubles the air pressure.
Yep.
And
so testing the old atmosphere, we know at least that it was 50% more oxygen.
50% more oxygen. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So what would that do to, let's just say, plant life?
Yeah. So the evidence of what it had done to plant life is pretty obvious. There's plenty of fossils that we find of familiar plants and animals, but in this case plants like ferns and other things that are enormous. And there was actually a doctor in Japan who did a study on this. His name was Dr. Kai Mori at Keio University in Tokyo. So he wanted to test the implications of this pre-flood world on vegetation.
Okay.
So he made a greenhouse which filtered UV light similarly to how that ice layer would. He had stem covers that delivered pressurized, in this case CO2, because plants do CO2, but keeping the ratio about the same, but just double pressurized it around the stems of these cherry tomato plants. And cherry tomatoes are little.
Right.
Little plants. If you had a garden, you've seen those, not too big. And what he found, so a normal cherry tomato plant, for reference, it grows to about 36 to 48 inches tall, produces tomatoes 1 to 2 inches in diameter. And in 1 year, an average plant produces about 300 cherry tomatoes. Okay, so that's a normal cherry tomato plant.
Okay.
Dr. Maury's plant, after 2 years, was 16 feet tall, had produced 907 tomatoes that were baseball sized, and they had to end up moving it and building scaffolding for it to hold it up. And it ended up growing over 40 feet tall, producing 15,000 tomatoes a year.
What? That were the same size then? The size of baseballs?
Giant tomatoes, yes.
Well, okay. All
Yeah.
right. So that's
that's an example on one cherry tomato plant.
I've
Imagine
got to
the
find
world.
I've got to find me one of these pressurized deals, because when I tried to grow tomatoes, I was trying to grow regular heirloom tomatoes.
Okay.
And what ended up happening was they were all about an inch or two round, and all of them died. I only got like 4 tomatoes out of like 5 plants. So maybe I should have been working off a double oxygen pressurized thing. So anyway, so tell me what that, so plant life, it would have been abundant.
Oh, yeah.
The fruit that was available. So is this what Adam and Eve would have eaten? What was their diet like?
Yeah, so if we go back to Genesis 1, right at the end there, and I don't think we really touched on this a whole lot.
Yeah, we
were
hadn't
going
talked about
through it.
that yet. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So verses 29 and 30 is when God is giving commands to Adam and Eve with regards to their diet.
Oh, okay.
So if we look at verse 29, he says, God said, "Behold, I have given you every green herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat." So that's Adam and Eve. They're vegetarian.
Okay.
And from
All
what
right.
we can tell, there was a lot to eat.
Yeah.
So, and then that carries one step forward. He goes further and he says, "Into every beast of the earth, every fowl of the air, into everything that creeps upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat," and it was so. So it's not vegetarian the way that we think of it today. The animals ate the leaves. We ate the seed-bearing fruits.
Okay.
So, and he got it specific and said it 2 different ways. But for man, it was any fruit where there is a tree yielding seed. So seeds and fruits. And the seeds we find out, too, as we go further into some of the dietary stuff, when they look back at it. Seeds were a huge part of our diet. And we do know today that seeds are some of the most nutrient-packed and impactful things that we can add to our diet.
Yeah. So, and seeds are what define a fruit.
Right.
All fruit has seed.
Right.
I like to, again, I don't know how it keeps coming up, but tomatoes.
Yeah.
Tomatoes have seed, but tomatoes are actually categorized as fruit.
Right.
As are cucumbers, and you see lots of things that have seeds.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what defines it as being a fruit. So, and I'm going to go ahead and digress here for a second.
Sure.
What I love to talk about the idea of seed, and when God said, "Be fruitful and multiply."
Yeah.
And the whole idea that fruit has seed in it. I think that when God's telling us to be fruitful, he's telling us to be full of the seed that he's put there, that again, the seed of what he wants out of us, he's already put in us.
Right.
So he's already put the gift of being able to teach in you before you started using it. So everything that we need to do what God's called us to do is in us. It's just not been brought to life yet. The seeds are all there, just like in creation.
Right.
The seeds were in the ground, and God said, "Go," and they start growing. I think the same thing is true of people. The seeds of what God wants out of us are already in us. And I think that comes from being fruitful, because we're seedful if we're a fruit.
That is absolutely correct. And, every now and then a seed falls on the ground and takes root. But the other thing I think we know, if you're a good carer of the garden, good carer of said seeds, you're going to, be sure to water those things. You're going to be sure to make sure they have the sunlight and the feed. So you
Right.
need the energy, the resources, the nutrients, we know the Holy Spirit is that caretaker for us, and it's there to help produce the right kind of fruit out of our lives. And Jesus is the water, the living water. We need to have Christ in us for that to really blossom and to flourish.
Yeah, seeds on their own. You get a lot of wild things and weeds that grow up with them. And we see in the parable of the sower, right, that the weeds will grow up and choke out the good fruit, the good plant that's trying to grow. Yeah, you've got to weed the garden of your heart to make sure that only the fruit that God wants is what's growing. So that's sorry for the rabbit trail on that.
No,
let
you're
me
good.
let me get you back to again pre-flood world and what's going on. So Adam and Eve are eating fruit, and all of the animals are eating basically salads.
Yes.
That's the way we'd look at it there.
Yep.
And now man eats a lot of salads, but that's a different story. Now, so what would it have done to the lifespan of a person? Because we know
Right.
that, way back then that we see people that are, 900 years old and a little over.
Yes.
How does that work?
Yeah. So a couple of factors: the UV light being filtered out, the harmful radiation, because ultimately one of the major thing that causes aging for us is going to be, the sun monster. That harmful radiation is something that is what visibly decays us in a lot of ways. And then the other part of it is just our bodies breaking down. There's a concept in science that, the laws of entropy. And it's this idea that everything tends towards disorder, towards decay. And there was a gentleman, Dr. Barry Setterfield, who set out to kind of answer the question why with regards to certain elements of physics. And he
Now,
was...
why we age the way we do, or why death is encroaching upon us all the time, or...
So I think this is something that's worth a quick moment of rabbit trail, because
Okay.
it'll set up where we're going.
Sure.
Yeah. So when we look at the end of day 6 and God said everything is perfect, when we look at the Erev and Boker and what it really talks about, ultimately what we're talking about is from total chaos to perfect order.
Right.
At which point there is no decay, there is no death, there's no sin. Everything would ideally in that state sustain forever.
Right. So pre-fall
Pre-fall.
Earth. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Essentially perfect immortality, no death, no destruction. But something happens at the fall wherein we understand that the earth is cursed. Romans 8:22 says we know the whole creation groans and travails in pain together until now. Talking about that all of creation was affected by the fall, not just man. Sin had a detrimental effect on everything. And so that decay, essentially the laws of entropy that we know, those were instituted in the fall. That was kind of the curse is we've summed up in science as those laws of entropy in a way. And so we tend to recognize where its effects take place in various areas. But one of the things that, for the longest time science failed to recognize was that decay applies also to things we think to be constant, i.e. the speed of light. We go back to the dinosaur and we talk about how it's an inefficient creature. It couldn't exist. Well, the whole lungs and breathing and how much air it could get in, that's fixed by the pressure and the oxygen being higher. Now they could breathe just fine. But what about their brain? These are big creatures, right? So
now, hang on just a second. So when you say now they can breathe just fine, you're talking about in the pre-flood
Yes,
world.
yeah, now-
not now as in today,
yeah,
current.
today they couldn't.
Right,
But
exactly.
now that we understand the framework of the creation and the environment that they were created in, they would work okay.
Yeah, let me mention this real quick
Yeah.
before we move too much further on. I know that, if you've been in church any time at all, you've heard about the fall and the curses. But one thing I do want to point out, you say the snake is cursed to crawl on his belly, right? And the woman's seed will crush his seed. And then you see the woman gets cursed for childbirth is going to be painful now. But when it comes to Adam and what his punishment is, God directs the curse at the earth.
Right.
So that's a really interesting thing. So the snake gets punished, Eve gets punished, and Adam's punishment is deferred to the earth because that's what he's going to have to work.
Right. Well, and it's interesting too. Cursed be the ground for thy sake.
Yeah.
So
right.
hey, you're gonna have to work to eat, and it's good for you.
Yeah.
So message to all the kids out there, or anyone else who thinks they don't need to go get a job.
Yeah. Sorry,
So,
I digress. Go ahead.
No, you're good. So and so the other thing that we have to think in terms of how our whole body and our whole system works is reaction times. So we think about something comes in, your eyes perceive it, and then your brain goes, oh, I got to dodge, and then you move, right? So pain also, something hits you, that pain indicator, we think of that as very rapid because we're relatively small and we have, decently well-working systems. However, let's say that a brontosaurus, big old dinosaur, right?
Right.
Were to have something step on its tail, or let's say, a nasty critter goes to try to eat him in the tail.
Right.
So the amount of time under today's conditions, based on the current speed of light and the way and the resistance through the nervous system, it would take him a noticeable amount of time to even get the pain signal to his brain from his tail and then back to react. He'd be half gnawed up before he was able to flick that thing off. You know, we're not talking about like, you know, eternities here, but several seconds, which is not what we're used to in terms of reaction time.
Right. We're used to an instant as far as we're concerned.
Right. Yeah, so it'd make it a total sitting duck to predators. And let alone now, think of the regulatory systems in your body. So your brain has to dictate and take signals from your organs about what state you're in, about what you've eaten, and then it's got to respond and send instructions. All those instruction systems don't work with the current speed of light.
You don't work for an animal that size
For that
with
size,
the current
correct.
speed of light. So,
Yes.
so speed of light then isn't constant and fixed.
Correct. So there's a couple of things when it comes to, you know, figuring certain things out in physics. You know, we've got a couple of constants that come relevant here. One is Planck's constant. One is the speed of light constant that was kind of put into math by Einstein's famous equation that we know. And take for granted that they're both constants and you apply them where they need in every equation and they work out. What Dr. Barry Setterfield ended up discovering was that the speed of light was not a constant. So you go back into the 1800s when we started measuring it, and then you look at today's measurements, it's been decreasing a little bit. Now, we've attributed that generally to poorer instrumentation and better measuring technologies today. So we're just more precise now. But if you, in fact, presume that maybe, no, that's not the case, and then you chart that line backwards, what you end up with is a parabolic curve that about 6,000 years ago approaches infinity.
Okay.
Well,
now that's an interesting number, 6,000 years ago.
Roughly. And
Yeah.
Which, coincidentally is about the timeline of the Bible.
Right.
So
Right.
That's one interesting thing. So he thought to himself then, okay, well, if speed of light isn't constant, what else happens? And then the discovery ultimately leads to the fact that Planck's constant is inversely proportional to the speed of light. And Planck's constant was kind of a necessary mathematical figure in order to make certain equations work out, because they do the theory and then they do the experiment and they're off by a factor. And then so they repeat it and they're always off by the same factor. So that factor got named Planck's constant. Planck found that out.
Okay.
So that factor, turns out, Barry Setterfield's ultimate mission was to find out, what does it measure? Why is it necessary and what does it measure? And that's where this idea of 0-point energy comes in. He defined that as something where in an absolute vacuum at absolute zero temperature, so no energy, no matter, according to anything that we know about, ideally there should be nothing, right? Turns out there's more energy in nothing than we can, comprehend.
Okay.
And so that energy ends up being the resistance in the fabric of our universe. That is speed of light is having to fight in order to travel. So when we look at it in the reverse, back to the perfect creation, there's no resistance. Everything is instantaneously, perfectly efficient, with there's no roadblocks in the movement of even electricity and light. Everything is perfect. And therefore, there would be no decay. There would be no aging. There would be nothing. Every system was a perfectly efficient system. Every engineer on Earth is trying to develop the most efficient system they can.
Right.
Imagine every system was perfect.
So
that was the situation.
That
we were
being
in.
the case,
Yeah.
living to 900 years, not a problem at all.
Right. Yes. So, and they always talk about, they fell asleep, Is it polite? Is it what? I mean, God promised we'd die at some point.
Yeah.
We don't know exactly how everything ticked down, because we were post fall at that point.
Right.
So
yeah.
there was some decay beginning. But
Decay
it was
had
much
begun
slower,
after the fall.
Much
Yes.
slower.
Yes.
But when you look at the line too, from in the beginning, it was dropping precipitously. And then it, like any parabolic curve, it slowly starts to taper off. And now we're in the tail of that curve where it's approaching its flat line. So it's still going down very, very slowly, but it's approaching a flat line where we're beginning to see it far more constant than it would have been. So they would have been going down rapidly in the very beginning.
So this explains this again, the fall, the beginning of the decay, but before that, and then, before we get to the flood, we're talking about, again, all this pressure in the atmosphere being totally different with the oxygen. So that's what's accommodates for creatures the size of dinosaurs. It accommodates for people being able to live to 900 years old because of this lack of decay, or this very, very slow, process of decay.
Right.
So is that where we see, again, the fossil record of things that are, what's in the fossil record?
Oh man, all sorts of stuff. Big things, lots of things. Like what? I think it was like a 10-foot dragonfly or something like that.
Wait, say that again.
I don't remember the exact size of it, but it was several feet across dragonflies. And then when we go to plants and dragonflies, the reason I bring that one up is because we breathe air,
Yeah.
and if we fill our lungs and it goes to our blood, does all our stuff. Insects don't breathe; they absorb it through their skin, and as they get bigger, their internal mass grows faster than their surface area.
Okay.
And so the surface area of the body is all they have to work with in terms of absorbing oxygen. So there's a limit to the size that insects can get before there's not enough oxygen intake to sustain the internal mass. 50% more oxygen, double air pressure, squeeze that oxygen in at a much higher rate. Now insects get enormous.
Okay.
So there's
all right.
So that's again another evidence. How would a dragonfly ever get that big? They literally physically are impossible today. Well, they weren't back then.
See, this will help us imagine what the world was like.
Yeah.
If you had a tomato plant that's 40 feet tall.
Yeah.
If you had dragonflies that could approach 10 feet.
Right.
If you had dinosaurs and all of these things, very, very different than what we could even imagine today.
Right. Well, and then the trees, just the trees themselves.
Oh, yeah.
So, we talked about ferns and other things. So there was a fossil of a tree found in Wyoming, and each leaf was 5 feet long, 3 feet across, and 3 inches thick. We think of how leaves are paper thin, we tear them.
Yeah.
3-inch thick leaves that are feet across.
Again, we can't wrap our brains around that.
No, and that's just one leaf off of a tree. So now scale the tree up. We think
Right.
the redwoods are big in California.
Right.
No,
Now, and
we
that
haven't
will
seen big
that
trees.
will absolutely. When Laura and I were out in California for a while, that was the most amazing thing to go to a redwood national forest.
Yeah.
And you're standing. We got pictures, and the pictures don't do it any justice at all, because when you're standing beside this thing that looks like a building, here on the East Coast, we don't have things like that, and you can't really until you've stood beside it, and your brain doesn't register that that's a tree.
Yeah.
It just doesn't, because we can't understand, and that's just a tiny taste of what it would have been like pre-flood.
Right.
For trees and everything else. So then because we talked about big things, and again, you touched on dinosaurs, but so the question is, how did dinosaurs fit into this biblical history, the biblical narrative? Because I don't see the word dinosaur in there.
No, and which kind of makes sense. We invented that word much, much later. So the word dinosaur was kind of an 1800s, comes from Old Greek, which is translated terrible lizard. I think a lot of people know that little factoid, right? Yeah. So when we look at dinosaurs pre the word dinosaur, we called them dragons. That word's been around for a long time.
Yes.
Terrible lizard was just a new way to wrap up dragon. Now, get your tinfoil out. I feel like they had to come up with a new name because they were trying to discredit and write a new narrative about history and say that they didn't exist. Because this term was coined, 50 years or so after the big push for a new worldview.
Yes, and the tinfoil would be to make a hat. Right.
To make a hat, yes, because you got to wear your tinfoil hat when you start to talk conspiracy theories. So,
right.
No, I personally, I feel as though that word was probably introduced intentionally to continue to obfuscate the true narrative of history so that they can write a new one that doesn't include God. Because the legends of dragons everyone knew and everyone told. Well, then dragons suddenly became mythological because now there's a science word called dinosaur, and we know those were gone millions of years ago.
Yeah.
So
we think.
Yeah. So they rewrote history into fairy tale and created new terminology to be able to explain what they called truth.
Does it make sense to think about again the idea of dinosaur meaning terrible lizard? But if I've got a lizard that can grow for 900 years,
right? Because lizards don't stop growing.
I know, right?
Yeah.
So in this pre-flood world, I mean, that's not a bad description of this thing. A terrible lizard that's grown to this enormous size.
Yeah.
I would think that would be terrible if I were walking around.
Well, and there are legends of dragon slayers throughout all of history. The dragons always seem to be rare. They don't seem to be the size that we find in the fossil record, which makes sense because now we're talking all those factors gone. They wouldn't grow as big.
Right.
And then the breeds of lizards that were able to get big because the ones we see today are relatively small.
Mm-hmm.
Chances are they are mostly extinct. But there's a much lower ceiling to their maximum size now.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're going to become wealthy, famous, and get the best girl in town by going and slaying the local dragon, how much you want to bet people are out there slaying the local dragons?
Mm-hmm.
And based on some of the missionaries that we've had into the Congo and other places in Africa, their testimony about the beasts that they can point to in our dinosaur picture books and say, yeah, they live over here, this is what they eat, and they smell bad, and they'll attack you on sight.
Yeah.
Stay out of that swamp.
Yeah. Yeah.
They'd only describe them as a few feet tall, though.
What is the lizard that's like I can't remember, but it's several feet long.
The Komodo dragon?
Yes.
Yeah.
Imagine that thing at even 10 times its current size.
Right.
You talk about a mind-bogglingly, horrifically scary beast that to be able to encounter. I mean, those things are crazy dangerous as they are now.
Yeah, and the other thing to consider too is if Noah had them all on the ark after the flood, as that atmospheric change takes place, there's a high probability that a lot of them, because they were brought in as onto the ark as adolescents. That way, they come off the ark, now they have a full lifespan to reproduce and repopulate.
Yeah.
There's a possibility that a lot of the larger breeds, we don't know, in order to reach their sexual maturity to be able to reproduce, what does their physiology have to get to? At what point in their growth scale do they become viable to reproduce? It may just be that a lot of them died off right after the flood because they could never become viable. So you're going to see a thinning of the herd very, very quickly, and then the few that survive become the dragons of legend. But I think God at least mentions 2 dinosaurs in the Bible. So
I want to hit it. We're going to have to wrap it up in just a minute. So one last question here.
Sure.
And again, it has to do with the age of the Earth and fossils and things that have been around, according to science, millions of years.
Right.
How did we get so much? Because you got to talk about this if you're going to talk about the fossil record. How do we get so much oil and coal into the Earth if, as we say, the Earth isn't millions of years old?
Sure. Yeah. So a couple of factors. We talked about before God created the Earth to be inhabited, which, I think indicates the fact that when he created the Earth, we had small bodies of water, but the Earth was generally one supercontinent. And then most of the water was under the Earth. So people who like to scoff at the Bible, they will point to the current biomass of all the Earth. So all the plants and animals on Earth today. And we already talked about there's only a couple % of the Earth that's really covered in all this stuff. But they'll look at all the biomass in the Earth and say, if you buried it all and turned it all into coal and oil today, you wouldn't get a fraction of what we find under the Earth. So there's no way that the Earth could sustain in one flood the amount necessary to create the massive reserves. So it's based on what we look at. But what does the Bible say? They're going to look and say, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. No.
Right.
The cracks in the Earth's crust. I grew up in school. I remember one of my first projects making Pangea, cutting the continents out and trying to make them glue back together. We do know the Earth's crust is cracked. Question is, when did that happen? How did it happen? And does that by definition mean that everything has shifted? I don't think so. So the cracks happen to be in the thinnest parts of the crust. We don't think of the Earth's crust as thick and thin. We think of, tall mountain, deep ocean.
Right.
But ultimately, if you zoom out and you look at it like an orange peel, these are like the thick parts and the thin parts. And the cracks are all in the thin parts. So now if we were to say, take all that water, put it below the crust of the Earth, the Bible explains that it was. And then that is now under extreme pressure. And you're going to have some thin parts where maybe you have some springs and you have, a little bit of water that's coming up from the Earth. The Earth is like super saturated. So all the plants have everything in their roots because the roots grow down to find the water. Well, all the water started below them anyways. And now you've got a Earth surface that is completely able to be covered in vegetation. So now not only do we have not 3%, but say 99% of the Earth covered in vegetation,
right,
and animals, and they're a lot bigger. Now we start to factor in all of these things and to say, well, if, let's say, something happened to the Earth, i.e. God's judgment, whatever mechanism he used, the Earth's crust cracked and the fountains of the deep came forth. as it says. So the cracks are ultimately, if you were to strike something that's under extreme pressure, like, and then all of a sudden you see the crack that spreads all the way around. I think we have the evidence of that. And I think the Marianas Trench in the Atlantic is probably the initial crack, and then you had some fracturing that went from there.
So all of the plant and animal life that would have existed over, a large percentage of the earth, because we're not talking about oceans existing at that point, right? All of that dies in the flood and gets compressed down, and now you have, again, oil and coal.
Yeah, and I misspoke. I said Marianas Trench. I meant the Mid-Atlantic Ridge.
Okay.
I don't know why I said that. Sorry. So because if the earth is mostly level, not big mountains, maybe some hills, water's underneath, holding up the thin spots to be relatively level with the thick spots. The thin spots break, found as a deep burst force, that water all rushes out and covers the earth. It's going to be a big muddy mess. And
That's true.
And we know that the whole earth was covered. Well, what do tides do? The moon moves and it takes the tides, but the tides are limited by the coasts. They can only rise so high before the moon passes off and the weight of gravity pulls the water back down. Remove all land masses. Now you have a harmonic tide that's a couple hundred feet tall, following the moon, encircling the earth, reshuffling and recycling and settling all that sediment, just burying it layer upon layer upon layer with each passing tide wave and crushing everything underneath. Therefore, intense heat, intense pressure, a global oil industry is born.
Thus oil and coal.
Right.
And let's bring it to a close right there, because now we're starting to get into the flood and what was going on there, and we're going to be hitting that pretty soon anyway. But for now,
it's important to answer those questions.
Right.
These factors are necessary to put the picture together. Absolutely.
Right. And so that's what we're trying to do. Let's paint the picture. This is pre-flood. What's going on? Because it answers so many of our modern day questions. Where did dinosaurs go? Where did the coal come from? All these things. If you take it back and you understand a little bit of the science, it all gets proven out that the Bible's telling you the truth.
Yeah, and you don't want to miss a single piece.
That's exactly right.
God points out all the things that we need to know, and if we can follow those breadcrumbs and then we can go prove it out in observation, we suddenly find theories and methods of origins that are testable, repeatable, and like we can set up the experiments to test those conditions that are described in the scriptures. Everything that they want us to believe about the old earth is taken on faith alone. There's no evidence. They have never found anything. They find the same rocks, but they wrote a different story about them. We have a story that is backed up by not only God's word, but also a more plausible explanation to put it together.
That's a good word. Let's end it right there. Andy, thanks for coming out and hanging out with us today.
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me.